Hello and welcome to Model Aviation Live. I'm Jay Smith, your host, executive editor of Model Aviation and Park Pilot magazines. Before we get started and share some information about our guest, I want to share with you a few interesting things that I've added to my personal collection. At times when I do the show, I sometimes like to mention aviation related items that maybe I've purchased or gotten. I've shared a few books in the past and whatnot. So there's three items in the last month that I think some viewers might really be interested in hearing a little bit about. So without further ado, the first one that I want to talk to you about is my 1917 Omega Mark V cockpit watch. So long story short, this watch was issued to the Royal Flying Corps. It was built in England in 1917, and it was issued to the Royal Flying Corps in 1917. And how I know that is it might be hard to see on screen, but on the back of the watch, there's an A and an up arrow, and that denotes that it was issued to the Royal Flying Corps. So a pilot would have been given it, and I've been looking for one that did not have the stem drilled to turn it into a pocket watch. After the war, many of these watches were sold to the railroad, and they would drill the stem and put a loop on it so that they could be carried by conductors like a pocket watch. And the belief is that about 75% of these watches were converted. So only maybe 20 to 25% remain original. This obviously, as you can see, is original. And so it took me 2 years to find it, and I just got it earlier this week, and it works. It's 100 and I believe 6 years old, and it works. So I just thought that it'd be interesting to share that. And the last thing I'll mention is the person that I got it from actually worked for Peter Jackson as a sculptor with his Wingnut Wings company. And now they own a company where they sell aviation memorabilia and medals and stuff like that. The company's called Jaeger Metals. But anyway, I just thought it was an interesting thing to get. And the photos that we're sharing actually are the photos that he used to share information about the watch. And as you can see, he opened it up and whatnot. So anyway, that was the first thing that I thought you might find interesting. The second thing I want to talk to you about is I purchased a SPAD wing rib that you can see there. That comes with aviation artwork, and that wing rib has a very interesting history, or that plane, but including the wing rib, has a very interesting history. That plane, interestingly enough, was constructed in 1917, and obviously in England, and it was in the war, in World War I, and this is all documented by a couple of, three articles that I've found in the 30s and 40s. But that aircraft, after the war, was brought to the U.S. and tested by the U.S. military. And when they were done with it, they sent it to, or sold it to, Paramount Pictures. And that airplane was used in Wings, the movie Wings from 1927. The movie Wings was the first movie to win an Academy Award. This SPAD was actually purposely crashed on film. Dick Grace was the stuntman, and it was the lead character had been, partly he'd received a lot of bullets and in combat, and he was trying to land in between the trenches because the plane was all shot up. And between the trenches, when he landed, the plan was for it to get caught on the barbed wire and stand up on its nose or flip over. So Dick Grace flew the actual airplane and landed and flipped it over. And at that point, the airplane was sold to someone known as the airplane junk man, who was the first person to basically have a junkyard of aircraft. There was an article about him in Flying Aces magazine, which I have a copy of, and he sold it to a gentleman, I believe his name was Colonel Jarrett, who had a World War I museum at Steel Pier in New Jersey, and he restored it because it was damaged from the landing in Wings, which you can see on film. I mean, it's a big moment, and you can see that on film. And he restored it. When he restored it, he removed that wing rib. because it needed to be replaced along with some other parts of the plane, mostly the wings and the landing gear. At that point, he sold the parts that he took out of the plane to a gentleman who sadly passed away in 2002 or 2022. That his collection was then sold to an aviation artist in Ohio named Ron Cole, and Ron did this art print of the aircraft and put the actual wing rib on it. So I don't believe Ron knew everything that I'm sharing with you. He knew some of it, but I was able to find 2 articles about the plane being in World War I, about the plane coming to the U.S., being sold to Paramount, and it was the one that Dick Grace flipped over in the movie. The plane currently is on display in Canada, but it was at the Dayton Air Force Museum for a while in the 60s. So I've actually, believe it or not, I'm actually getting this delivered today. So if you happen to hear before this show is over some dogs barking, then it's here. So I'm excited to finally get to actually see it. But that's another interesting piece that, I think as modelers, sometimes we use the internet obviously as a resource, especially if we want to do a scale model or come up with paint schemes. So I used it in the same manner and found an article from 1934, a 1935 article, and a 1941 article to, provide, I guess, documentation that what this aircraft saw and where it ended up. And so I'm excited to have that. And then while we're talking about artwork, I've got one more thing to share. Joe DeMarco. If you've been in the hobby a while, or if you're into aviation art, you probably know the name Joe DeMarco. He started as an artist in the 60s until he passed away, sadly, in 2012. His main focus was from the Wright Flyer through World War I, and he would do pencil sketches, and the original pencil sketch would then be used to make prints that were sold at the Dayton Air Force Museum, the Smithsonian, Kitty Hawk, and they were even sold at Toledo, at the trade show in Toledo. Prior to me going, I don't know who was selling them, but the art prints were sold because our previous ad rep, Mark Landerman, bought a print of this. But what you're seeing is the original. That's the actual original drawing by Joe DeMarco. It was drawn in May of 1974, and that was used to make the prints. Interestingly enough, the art prints were 11 by 14, but that is 14 by 17. So it's actually slightly larger than the art print. And I know it's probably hard to see, but at the bottom, he wrote in pencil everything he wanted on the print, like, Wright Flyer 1903 and copyright Joe DeMarco, and then he signed it. And so I'm really honored and excited to, I guess for now, be the custodian of all 3 items that I've shared with you. And I've been a fan of Joe's art for many years, and I've seen his art in many places, including Mark Landerman's basement, where he has several, including this one, the prints. So anyway, I just thought we're all generally aviation like-minded, so I like to share these things. And the next thing I want to talk about before we bring out our guest is I want to talk about SIG manufacturing. In the January issue, I went and attended the SIG fly-in, and obviously I did the article about it, and there was a photo on the cover. And recently there's been a real estate listing that the facility that's been there since the 50s is for sale. So that led to a lot of questions. I received phone calls and emails, and, is SIG going out of business, or why did you write an article about SIG if they're closing? So I wanted to share that they are not closing, but the owner, Herb, who owned SIG previously and took SIG back, he has 2 other companies that he owns, and they are in just north of Chicago, and he's decided to move SIG's operation to the same location as his other 2 companies, which his other 2 companies do hobby stuff as well, mostly train. At least one of them is mostly trainer related. So he is going to relocate SIG to the new facility early this year, maybe probably late first quarter, I'm assuming. So because of the number of people that asked questions about SIG, I thought I wanted to share that with you. And I also told Herb, that he might want to share that information on their Facebook page and on their website. So the next day after I spoke with him, he shared on his website that you can see there, and also on their Facebook page, just letting everyone know they're relocating. So I just wanted to share that because I think a lot of of people were believing that they were closing and information was shared that they were closing. So I wanted to definitely make sure that I shared that SIG is definitely not closing. They're just moving their location. And the January issue is also a good segue for our guest today. And our guest has been on the show once before. We have Derek Micko joining us today to talk about his construction article that was in the January issue. And then we're going to talk a bit more about his techniques in printing and using tissue. So, Derek, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So you and I were talking briefly right before the show, and I was talking about the three things that I was going to share that I have recently added to the collection. And if you wouldn't mind sharing just briefly, I thought it was interesting to hear that you have some really neat aviation collectibles.
Yeah, so I had collected some aviational memorabilia over the years. I have the long pants that a waist bomber or waist gunner would wear in a B-17 bomber or a B-24, so it's really, really heavy wool and keep them warm in those freezing temperatures up at those higher altitudes. I have some aviation goggles and an aviation helmet. And I also have some newspapers from historical dates. So when Pearl Harbor was attacked, the day after that, and victory in Europe and victory in Japan and those sorts of things. It's really interesting to kind of read those articles that came out and how the prevailing way of writing was at that time period.
Well, as I mentioned to you, I think a lot of people that are involved in this hobby do appreciate that. And just this week, I've talked to two other people that have aviation collectibles and memorabilia. So it's definitely neat to be able to showcase that. And we're fortunate here in Muncie. We're only about an hour and a half from the Dayton Air Force Museum, so I try to make it over there whenever I can. And there's a Dawn Patrol event that happens there every other year, which is great because it's the model aircraft and full scale, and Balsa USA comes, and it's really, really a neat event. But today we want to talk a little bit first about the aircraft that you designed and built and shared with us. So tell us a little bit about that aircraft and why you chose that aircraft.
Sure. So it's the Macchi 202 Folgore, which I believe means lightning in Italian. It was a variation of the Macchi 200, which was a radial engined aircraft. And you can see on the screen there, this one is an inline. It uses the same DB engine that was in the ME 109. And the Italian government did a license build and actually bought some first. So a lot of the early Macchis had the German built engine, and some of the later ones had the Italian license built one. Unfortunately for the Italians, they had some challenges in getting the right tooling set up, and so they had some reliability issues. But I wanted to do the Macchi for a couple different reasons. One, it's a uniquely under-modeled airplane. There are some out there. Dave Platt did a really fantastic one that was quite large a few years back. But it's something you don't see very often. It's got really elegant lines to it and has very colorful liveries that you can choose for different paint schemes. The one that I chose actually was the same paint scheme that my dad built back in the 80s. He built a Macchi from Dennis Bryant plans. And these were really, really nice plans. It was about a 60-inch range, about the same size as the Top Flight kit. And so I thought it'd be kind of fun to do one up in the same color scheme that he had done so many years ago.
Well, it's I think it's a great color scheme, and actually in the comments, someone mentioned that that's their high school colors, green and gold, and Sycamore High School in Cincinnati. So, tell me a little bit about, I talked about researching this wing rib that I'll be getting today. And obviously, whenever we build scale models, we look at documentation and maybe research pilots. So, generally speaking, Derek, like with this project or in general, what sources are you using to determine what scheme you want to go with?
So a good question. If I'm designing an airplane, I'll usually start with a search for a good set of technical drawings, or 3 views or 5 views, and really want to have cross sections, especially of the fuselage, and if it's a multi-engine airplane, cross sections of the nacelles. That's really critical in getting a nice, accurate outline. And you can find that in multiple different places. So for the Macchi, I found some 3 views online. I picked up quite a few different books and sort of picked and chose to see what the best outlined drawing was. And then from there, I imported that into CAD and traced that outline, and then from there designed the model. But for research on, detailing and accuracy, books are always great. Walkarounds, you can do walkarounds. You quite often find them online. But a resource, especially for doing, which color scheme you want to do, plastic models is a great resource. And a lot of those websites have colorful different views. So they have the side of each profile. So you have a left and a right profile of fuselage, because a lot of the times you may have an insignia on one side and it's not on the other. So that's very helpful. And there's a lot of different sites that are out there. Edward is a detail site, and they do a lot of photo etched and decals. And I'll go on their site quite frequently if I'm researching a new project to see, what do they have? Because a lot of times they'll have a drawing or a photograph of their detail set. So maybe it's a cockpit, so you'll have the instrument panel and maybe some of the throttle quadrants and that sort of stuff that be inside the cockpit. And that's a great point of reference when working on your model as well.
Absolutely. Michael Smith and I were looking at a Wingnut Wings kit, which I mentioned to them a little bit earlier. Mm-hmm. And of course, for those that don't know, Peter Jackson was responsible for the Lord of the Rings films and the Hobbit films and several others. And he has some World War I aircraft of his own, full-scale World War I aircraft of his own. And the detailing on those was amazing. And it comes with, if you've never seen one, it actually comes with a booklet with actual photos of real, whatever aircraft it is. Like if it's a Sopwith Camel, it comes with real black and white photos of the aircraft. And obviously the internet's a great resource. And one of the things that I really wanted to talk about today was your technique of using tissue and printing on tissue, because I've gotten so many comments, not only with this project, but other projects that you've shared with us. So we have a series of photos that you provided us, and I think it would be great to have you kind of talk a little bit through the process, and you can talk a bit about, what you're showcasing in each photo. And then I also think you have a few things there that you want to show. So let's talk a little bit about that, about the process and how you came about it, and, tips and tricks for doing it, and kind of give us some insight into the photos.
Absolutely. So in this first picture here, you can see some of the templates that I use to initiate creating the patterns for the printed tissue. So I use, it's kind of that brown wrapping paper. It's real lightweight and semi-translucent. So if you use a light shining across the back of your model, you can trace this out. So I trace this out, and if you can kind of see on the pictures, there's some reference lines. And that's really important when you're first starting out, if you're creating your own templates. What I recommend doing is, especially if you're doing like a free flight model or a stick and tissue model, to choose one stringer, and that is your reference point of everything else. So that's where you line up your template before you would put it on the airplane. So this here is sort of the starting out of, these are the templates for the Macchi, for the fuselage. And so you can see on the top section there, that's sort of the front nose section. Bottom right is sort of the middle section, and then bottom left would be the tail section. And then once you've sort of started your pattern, what I do is I then take them and import them into CAD and trace them. And I start adding panel lines and reference points and hatches. And I print those out on standard paper, and then I temporarily tape them to the model. So you can kind of see here of all the different sections on the fuselage. And then what that allows you to do is to start identifying, okay, well, I need to trim this section here. I need to trim, move this panel line ever so slightly. If you want to go to the next picture, you can kind of see an example of that. So if you can kind of lean into your screen, you can see that in the hatch area, there's some spots where I didn't have my panel lines matching up to where that I wanted to. So I'm using these as references. And then I take that and I go back into my CAD program and finalize it. And then once that's done, then you can start adding the color, the insignias, the squadron logos, all that stuff like that. So once you get your template, each individual template set, then that's when you want to start adding the details, if you will. And so here you can see these are completed patterns, and you can see that this would be the vertical and the rudder. Quite often I'll print these as one piece, and then I'll cut the tissue, like the control surface, away before I start applying it. So you do have the option on like these flat sheet tail surfaces. You can cover them together with it hinged, but I found it a little bit easier to actually still cover them as separate pieces. So that's what I'm doing in this picture here, and I'm cutting out the template. This here is already been printed onto the tissue. And I can show it a little bit here on kind of how I get that all prepared. But one thing I do recommend is to cut to not peel the tissue away from the carrier sheet right away, to actually cut each individual piece out and then remove it, because you lose some of the sharpness of the lines if you just peel off the tissue and then try and cut the tissue afterwards.
Real quick, we got a question. Squiggy asked a question: how do you even get balsa wood anymore? I can't find it anywhere. Maybe now would be a good opportunity to point out that kits are available for the stuff that you design. But generally speaking, are you finding problems with balsa wood or finding balsa wood?
I would say I'm still able to find it with some good consistency. I know SIG, we mentioned them, they carry balsa. There's a couple others that are in the United States here where you can still get them through mail order. There has been a higher demand on it globally, because I think there's a lot of other uses now for balsa wood, especially like in the China market. So it can be a little bit more expensive than what it has been historically. But as you mentioned, yes, this model, while the plans are available for download on Model Aviation, if you want to order a short kit, you can get that through Manzano Laserworks. They have really good selection of the wood that they use in their kit, so it's usually very, very lightweight. I can't recommend them enough. I've been working with them for years. They carry quite a few of the kits that designs that I offer. So the P40, which we had as an article last year, and the P63, both of those are available as short kits through Manzano.
Perfect. So what are we seeing here?
So this one here is just a couple of examples of what it looks like once it's been covered. So the top picture is the underside of the horizontal, and the bottom picture is actually the top side, so that tissue has been applied. With tissue, you're still going to have some transparency or translucentness, so you'll see the structure underneath. So it's kind of a benefit if you can, if you like that, to be able to see how the model is put together. And one of the things that we'll show in a little while here is some of the experimenting I've been doing with different types of tissue. So, traditionally there's free flight tissues, as we describe it, or Japanese tissue. It's a little bit more, it has a different fiber to it than, say, domestic tissue, which you would maybe find like in a gift wrap bag or something like that. And if you get that sort of tissue wet, it sort of turns into a melted pile. Whereas, Japanese tissue or tissue that's designed for free flight models, it gets wet, but it doesn't necessarily turn into mush. What I've started using, and this is on this particular model right here, is crepe paper, or also known as exam paper, exam table paper, excuse me. And it's exactly what it is. It's the type of paper that you'll see when you go to the doctor's office and they pull it over that table. It's the same material. It's a little bit, has a little more density to it, and therefore it accepts more of the ink when you print it. So you have a little bit better color saturation. It doesn't have as much of the see-through factor, especially when you have both the top and the bottom of a surface covered. So in this one here, starting to cover the fuselage, and you do move from the back moving forward, so because each panel overlaps the other one. So here you can see kind of that dark gray area, that's marking where the horizontal stabilizer, that will be cut out later once you have it completely covered and sealed. And then this is one of the center sections that has the fighter squadron logo on it. So it's a cat with 3 mice. there's a white band that logo sits on top of. And what I've found is if it's just one layer of white tissue, you don't get as much, it's a little bit transparent. So what I've done here is on the left side of that picture, that's just additional tissue that I'm gluing right over on the back side of where the white would be. So you sort of have a double layer of white, and that creates a much sharper white color on your fuselage, or whatever sort of structure you're covering. And there you can see with it applied. So you can see how much more less translucent that white color is, and how much more the cat and the mice pop out at you as far as color. So some more covering it's in place. One thing I recommend doing, and you'll see that in some of the pictures here, is even though you've tested it before you start putting glue on it, hold and wrap that tissue around the actual structure that you're doing, to make sure you don't need to trim a little bit on the top or the bottom or the side, and make sure that your alignments all fit. And here I'm doing exactly that. So it's one of the forward sections. And what I like to do is I use a glue stick. So these are those Elmer's glue sticks that go on purple or blue and dry clear. It makes it so much easier to kind of tell where your glue is. And I put glue on both the structure itself as well as the perimeter of the tissue panel that I'm attaching. And there's the application of it. And it's kind of tough maybe to see in the picture, but again, there's little tick marks, little reference lines on each panel that you use to line up with that center stringer to make sure that everything sort of matches up and you don't have any mismatched panel lines or color patterns. So one of the things that I've found with tissue that's been printed on, because you do need to seal that, otherwise the ink will run just by touching it or by when you're trying to shrink it with water, is you do need to seal it. I use Krylon Clear. They've got a bunch of different, they've got clear, flat, gloss, all sorts of different things. And you basically, once you've printed the tissue, you do need to seal it. But in that sealing, you lose a little bit of the elasticity and the shrink properties of the tissue. So you have to get kind of creative when it gets to be compound curves. So in this is the furthest nose section, and it gets to be real sort of pointed and curved. What I did was I put glue all around the outside of the structure, which is what you would normally do. But then I put it on each individual stringer. And what I did then is, I'll sort of show on the spare fuselage here, I put the tissue along this edge and pulled it taut. So, it was sort of kind of sticking out a little bit. And then along each one of these panels or stringers, I did a little slit with an X-Acto knife, and that allowed it sort of overlap and lay much flatter against the surface, and it got rid of most of the wrinkles. And here, just working on the wingtips, you can see the pointer is going to the little tick marks that you would use. So there's, just like you would on a center stringer on the fuselage, there's a center stringer on each wing that you use as your reference point. And then again, applying the glue to the surface before, on both surfaces, so both the structure as well as the tissue itself before applying it. And here, that's what I've been doing in this photograph right here. And then I've applied the wingtip pattern. You can see there's an overhang over the tissue, or over the wingtip itself. So you go in afterwards and trim it with the scissors and sort of get it, along the actual outside perimeter. You sort of make little cut marks, and that allows you to lay that flat against the outer edge of the wingtip. And then one thing that I like to do with, especially some of these smaller models, is to build washout into the wing. And so that little tab that's sort of hanging down below the trailing edge of the tip there, that's what that is. It's sort of a little wedge shape that goes underneath the wing when you're building it. I also use that when I'm finishing the covering. So I'm using a popsicle stick to sort of smooth out the tissue over the wingtip itself. And so that when I cover it, I'm covering it with the washout in versus trying to forced in washout after you've covered the wing. And then here I'm covering the wing with the aileron in place. So I'm using that little popsicle stick to sort of ensure that the tissue's getting into the crack. And then later that would be cut free, and any sort of little tag that hangs out would be glued flat against the surface.
That's the pictures, the way you put it together makes it a lot easier, I think, to follow the process. What about, let's talk a little bit about what's needed to print on the tissue, or some tips and tricks about using your printer. And, is there any, can you do it with any printer? What take us a little through that a little bit.
Certainly. So pretty much any type of color printer will work. If you're doing an inkjet, most of the time those types of inks are water soluble, so you will need to, then again, once you printed out your pattern, you will need to seal it. So again, I'll show the can that I use. This is Krylon Clear, and you just give it a couple of dustings, dust coats after you've printed it. And I do let the ink dry for a good 30-40 minutes just to give it a little bit, of additional chance to ensure that it's not going to fade and to sort of bleed when it does get wet. This is, I go ahead and show a little bit here. This is the actual tissue material. This is the crepe paper that I was mentioning. And you can pick it up online. This is a big roll that I have. You could probably do 1,000 airplanes and never run out of it. And it's pretty inexpensive. I think I got that roll for less than $15 online, shipped to my door. But what I do is most of the templates that I offer with my designs are on 8.5 by 14. So I'll actually cut a sheet of the tissue, and then I use spray adhesive. So I use Elmer's spray adhesive here to go ahead, and I do a light coat on a carrier sheet, which is just an 8.5 by 14 sheet. And then you just can carefully lay you can just go ahead and lay the tissue on it. And it's interesting, if you get wrinkles, you can still spread them out, or if you need to peel the tissue back, it's strong enough, as long as you don't overdo it on the adhesive spray, that you can go ahead and peel it off and reapply it if you make a small mistake. And then, of course, you always want to test your printer to see, when you're putting paper in it, which side does it actually print on? Is the back or the front, depending on the type of printer. I've made a few mistakes like that and had to resend stuff through. And I found what works best is if you have a rear feed option on your printer, versus trying to put it in the tray and have it run through the sort of the snake that it does inside the printer. And that can sometimes cause the tissue to come separated away from the carrier sheet and kind of sort of bog down your printer. But yeah, pretty much any type of printer would work. I mean, if you're doing something where if you're not worried about color, you can use a black and white printer. That, there's sometimes you get some inexpensive ones as well that just do black and white, and that would be just fine for most sorts of things if you're doing just lettering or numbers or something like that.
So for you, Derek, did you purposely buy a printer to do this, or did you just use the printer you already had?
I used a printer that I already had. So I have a very inexpensive HP model that has sort of the replaceable ink cartridges in it. And because I do this a lot, I've got sort of their ink program where once it runs out, they send you another one. It's a monthly bill, and it's pretty inexpensive. But I was actually surprised. I on my latest project, I purchased an additional set of ink cartridges because I thought, well, there's a lot of color on this that I'm printing. I'll probably have, halfway through have to replace my cartridge. But I printed an entire airplane that was about, I would say, 17 or 18 sheets of tissue, and most of those had a good portion of them colored in with some sort of color, and I didn't run out of ink. So it's not as ink costly as you might think it would be.
I ended up switching from an inkjet to a laser because I wasn't printing enough, and every time I went to print, the nozzles were clogged, and I had to run the process of unclogging, and that takes up ink. So I actually went to a laser printer. But obviously, if you're printing enough or you're doing enough templates like what you're doing, then that probably isn't a problem.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is the nice thing about lasers is I believe that is a waterproof ink, so you may not necessarily need to use the Krylon on it. I know some Epson printers are the same way. They maybe are not necessarily uh, laser, but their dye or their ink is a little bit different, and so that might be waterproof.
And for those that want to take on this process, you did mention that you buy the paper that you're using online. Do you happen to know the source or the name of where you get that from?
I just picked it up from Amazon.
Oh,
And
okay.
if you just search underneath exam paper, uh, you should be able to find it. Exam table paper, any sort of that combination would work. Or Cray, CRAPE, is the specific name that they gave for the one that I picked up.
And about how much you usually get on a roll, or is that how it comes as a roll?
Yep. This one I think is 25 feet. And it's also, interestingly enough, I was able to find one that was 14 inches in width. So it makes it really easy. You just have to pull out 8.5 inches and cut it, and you've got your sheet. There's no additional trimming. But I think this is 25 feet. And if I recall correctly, it was like $13, $14 shipped.
Now I know you've been using it on, I guess park size models or smaller models. Do you have any sense of, what size you think it would be applicable for, or what the limitations are?
I think you could probably use it up into maybe a 40-inch size range airplane. You'd have to do, each one of your, unless you've got a really big printer, you'd have to do it in different sections. So you might have to do, 2 or 3 panels for a wing, and then, to stop at, each, maybe every 3 or 4 rib bays where the next panel would start. Um, and there's no reason why, if you're doing a fuselage, you couldn't, instead of having them, the fuselage parts running this direction, you could have them run this way and just have, you know, um, taller sheets for your individual sections. So this was, twice as big, say, that you just would have one sheet that would go right here.
Right. Well, I think it's a great method. And like I said, we've gotten a lot of feedback on it. In fact, it's also interesting that I've gotten a few questions recently about, like today, we've already got questions about where you're getting your balsa from, or are you finding it hard to get your balsa? I've also gotten some questions that it seems like it's harder to get covering sometimes, to find covering or covering supplies. In fact, just this week, I went to Horizon Hobbies website and they don't currently stock a covering iron on Horizon Hobbies website. I don't know if that's just temporary. So obviously this is really nice if you're having any challenges finding the proper covering or something that makes sense. Obviously the materials you're using, since it's used as exam paper all over the world, I don't think it's likely going to be a shortage. It'll be available for many, many years to come, I would think.
Yeah, and like I said, I'll probably never run out of this material off just this one roll. So I've done 5 or 6 airplanes already just with this, and there's just so much, and it's so inexpensive. It's really it's really kind of a neat find. Now there's no free lunch, as they say, that that this tissue doesn't shrink with the same level as, say, Japanese tissue or conventional free flight tissue. And it's a little bit heavier, but for park flyers, that difference in weight is really negligible. I weighed a good park flyer, and I think it was half an ounce to maybe an ounce, which again for small airplanes can make a difference. But that was just for the overall covering, and that's not the difference between covering that airplane with standard tissue versus this. This was just how much the covering had. So it's not a significant gain.
And obviously the glue as well is very easy. You can get probably just about anywhere. So I think that makes it really accessible. In thinking specifically about the Macchi, I know we mainly have been talking about the tissue covering process and printing the tissue. But for those that might want to take that on, is there anything at all that you can think of that you might want to point out about the construction or flying of that model?
I would say, read the notes on the plans that come with it. Um, there's a link on Model Aviation's site there that goes to my build thread, and so I have a lot more pictures in there that sort of help, and I talk about how I'm constructing it. And then the other option is on my YouTube channel. I just loaded this last week here, a construction series on the Macchi, and so this one goes over building the tail section as well as framing up the fuselage, and I kind of walk through that with some video as well as some still shots of me talking over it. So there's a lot of little tips with it. It's not a difficult build by any means. There's just some things you want to do in specific order, and that sort of outlined either in the video or in the online and the notes on the plans.
So obviously this project, for you've completed it because you've done the article and you've done the videos. What is next? What's your next project, or what are you currently working on?
Well, the next project I'm working on is going to be another park flyer. It's going to be a little bit bigger because it's a twin engine airplane. So I'm doing a 40-inch P-38F. And that's the early version of the P-38 with the more streamlined cowl versus the later ones, which kind of look like the P-40 cowling. So I've got a boom here I can go ahead and show you guys. So this one is, as you can see, it's pretty much completed. I'm in the covering stage right now and setting up all the electronics. This also has printed tissue on it. And of course, you got to have a shark mouth whenever you can. So I found a P-38 with a shark mouth on it. This one I'm hoping is going to be pretty lightweight, maybe between the 16 and the 18 ounce range. It will have 3D printed spinners. And that's one thing I wanted to mention too about the Macchi as well as some of these other models is Rabid Models does the spinners for these. And he does a really great job. They're 3D printed spinners. They're very affordable. They're very nicely done. And then the other thing that I've sort of kind of worked out with Mark at Rabid is they offer a power pack for these park flyer models. So if you wanted to do the Macchi or the P63 or the P40, that you can get the spinner, the prop, the motor, the speed controller, and some additional hardware stuff all sort of in one. So it's really kind of a neat little package that you know, get the shark kit from Manzano, get the power unit from them, and all you need is just some servos and a receiver, and you're pretty much on your way.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because I did a review of the P-38 spinners from Rabid Models and worth a closer look in Model Aviation. And I've always got three issues in my head. I've got the issue we just finished, I've got the issue we're working on, and then I'm working with authors on the future issue. So I'm thinking it's either January or February, so very recent. I reviewed the P-38 spinners from Mark at Rabid. So that's great to hear that you're using those. And I have to say, love the shark's mouth. I always like P-40s because of the shark's mouth. And I didn't know that there was a P-38 with a shark's mouth, but it looks really good.
Yeah, there's a squadron in the Pacific that had them, and there's also some really cool nose art on this particular one, and that's sort of another technique that I found. So if you look at the Macchi here, you can see there's a little emblem here, a little logo, and what I found is if it's got dark colors like this one, you can go ahead and print it right in place over it. Right on the tissue. But if it's a lighter colored logo, what I recommend doing is having it as a separate tissue pattern. So you cover the model, shrink it, seal it, all that stuff like that, and then you glue the logo over the top of it. So that's one of the techniques that I'm using on the P-38 is, and you'll see in the build photos as I put them on my build thread that I'll be adding that sort of detail later on.
Well, Derek, I really appreciate you coming on the show. This is your second time and sharing these techniques. And like I said, we get a lot of great feedback on your articles. And of course, Paul Coleman too, you both work closely together and we've had the fighter face-offs. So really appreciate that. And excited to see more about your P-38 once you finish that. Is there anything else that you think we should touch on about the process or about your models that we haven't mentioned yet?
Well, I think there's a lot to talk about, and only got so much time for this particular chat, but if you go on my channel, Fun Scale Models is the name of my channel. I have a couple of videos that are dedicated specifically to covering models with tissue, and even how to repair a model that has printed tissue on it. So it's a couple of different videos on there you can check out. Talking about the P40, and the shark mouth, the one that we did in the article last year. I've got an entire series on how to build that, including how I'm applying the tissue on that. So some greater detail there too, if folks want to research it further.
Excellent. Well, really appreciate you being on the show and sharing and writing for us, and that way we can get building out to the masses and have some really neat stuff. And you build different sizes, but lately you've been focusing more on Park Flyer, which is great because not everybody has a space to build a big aircraft, or maybe they don't have a space to fly a big aircraft. So greatly appreciate all your contributions and being on the show. Also want to remind everyone that the next show will be February 17th. So we'll be announcing the guest soon on that show. And thank you, Derek, and appreciate everyone watching. And we'll see everyone again on February 17th.
Thanks for having me on.